Well, this is an evening with Laura Cramer. Now, Laura Cramer is a local artist and is perhaps best known for her unusual Bristol landscapes. She was born and brought up in Wexford in the Irish Republic, the daughter of a very well-known Irish sportsman. She was the youngest of 4 girls. The setting for her childhood was idyllic, and she became a daydreamer and a tomboy. But at 17, she broke away from a stable home life, and over a few dizzying years, she became a self-described globetrotter. She moved to and fro between Denmark, Russia, Canada, and Ireland with great frequency. And it was in that frantic period that the realization came that she must become an artist. She witnessed the attempted coup against Gorbachev in Moscow in 1991, and it was there she married Miguel, a Russian Argentinian. Same time, she had also learned to speak Russian and Danish. After their marriage, the couple eventually came to Ireland, but that was brief because after her mother had died, Laura felt she could no longer bear living in her home country, so they came to Bristol, where one of her sisters lived. They then made a life for themselves here and have 2 children. Laura's art began to flourish. She had a large commission at the Lawrence Hill Health Centre and became closely involved in public art, most notably with Gromit and Shaun the Sheep. With both her children in their late teens, her professional career as an artist is now moving to a new and important phase. Laura, welcome to Clifton Arts' first attempt at doing this on Zoom. Just tell us something about your art and your work. We've got a few images here, rather randomly selected, of some of your pieces of work. Perhaps we could just put the first one up, Ian, and you could just talk a little bit about it.
Well, firstly, Zoe, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very honoured to be part of this auspicious evening when it's raining cats and dogs outside. So, I mean, landscapes, basically, these are much looser landscapes that are, that very first one was a very recent painting I did just before Christmas. Florence in the Snow is probably about 7 years.
We're getting you freezing, which is the last thing I want on earth is that for Laura to freeze.
Oh dear.
She'll come back to us in a moment, I'm sure. Yes, she is.
I'll continue to talk about Florence in the Snow. I mean, essentially, it was my first foray into learning to handle landscape differently from the way I had painted previously. So this was a very exciting moment for me about 7 years ago. And I mean, who doesn't want to paint Florence in the Snow? It's such a rare occasion that that the snow falls, and yet the Santa Maria del Fiore is in this wonderful dusting of icing sugar type snow, but standing proudly amidst the quiet of the Tuscan background, which I just found very engaging, and I was keen to try and paint, and I felt it was a very successful painting.
Could we look at the next one, you think, Ian?
Yes, this is a pivotal one that perhaps Zoe and I might touch on again later, but this was done from the top of the M-shed balcony in 2013. And again, it's a very loose approach to cityscape painting, which differs when we look at my earlier work. And I just really enjoyed, it was acrylic on board, it was a plein air painting. It was a very kind of visceral approach when you're standing plein air. Any of you who've done plein air know what it's like. You've got to kind of not think and just do. And that very much was my response, excuse me, to a beautiful day up on the top of the M-shed balcony.
Okay, and the next one.
Yes, now this is a throwback. This is a much earlier painting. This is of the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff. And it would have been one of my earlier urban landscapes, and there is a much more controlled feel. I mean, I love this painting. Looking back on it, I believe someone local bought it, but it was done on water-soluble oil on card, and you can kind of feel that warm card coming through. It was an unprimed piece of card, but it was. I think the Millennium Stadium was quite had just launched, and I just found it a fascinating subject and an excuse to explore what I had learnt earlier on when I'd started painting.
And the next one.
Well, this is interesting because we're back now to a very new painting that I had done just before Christmas. And it's a cityscape. It's a view that I have painted many, many times before. But the approach to it is different from previous handling because I'm working with layers. I'm allowing just certain patches of pigment to fill certain areas. And it's more kind of seat of the pants. I'm not quite sure how it's going to resolve. And that's the way I paint pretty much at the moment and how I want to push forward. So it's interesting to compare that with earlier work.
Thank you. Right, Ian, if you could return us back so we see Laura in her full splendor. While he's doing that, I'll move on because the idea is that we just chat now about your life. We'll start at the beginning, and you've described your upbringing in Ireland as idyllic. But you had no sense in your childhood that art would one day play such a central part in your life. Why? Why weren't you drawn to art at the very beginning?
Well, I had a very creative household. My mother was wonderfully creative, and there was creativity everywhere. I think, having pondered on that question, Zoe, I think I had never met a professional artist at such a young age. And it was only when I went later travelled abroad that I did just that. But I lived in this idyllic setting on the southeast coast of Ireland. I could run from my kitchen across a small patch of, I don't know, 300 yards, scurry down a bank and onto a beach. It was the most extraordinary setting. And frankly, there was just too much to do to think about art. It was a painting in itself where I grew up. It was absolutely beautiful.
And you told me about the time, about the horse boxes, you used to have these, because your father ran stables at one point, and your mother arranged things so you could, as children, play houses, as you might say, inside these vehicles, as you might. Tell us about that.
Well, my mother was extraordinary. She talk about necessity being the mother of invention. She could make something out of anything. And we ran a family business, as you quite rightly say. The first business was a riding stable. So we had horses, and we had a very large horse box with one of these ramps that come down. And twice in my childhood, I remember us going to the west of Ireland in this horse box that was, my mother had painted the interior. She'd put beds in it, a little gas top, and all our supplies, and off we went for 4 hours towards the west coast of Ireland. Talk about health and safety. We as children were on the beds in the back, while my parents were in the cabin at the front of the lorry, driving on these old rickety roads with potholes, and we would bounce up and down on the beds as we were driving through the countryside. It was these days you just wouldn't do it. It was fabulous, and it was only about twice or three times I remember doing that. But what was most exciting or funny was to see the locals, when my father would jump down from the cabin, then go to the rear of the horse box, open it down, and then his children would come out down onto the street. So that got a few looks, certainly. We were quite unconventional as a family.
When you were at school, you had an art teacher. You had the chance to learn art, but you didn't get on with the art teacher so well.
No, correct. I hate to be unkind to people, but sadly, my art teacher was very weak, and it was one of these classes that attracted people who just wanted to avoid homework. So the art class was a subject that people chose if they didn't want to study. And those of us who were very engaged and wanted to learn found ourselves overpowered, and the teacher wasn't able to control the class. So I'm afraid it just became a non-starter for me. I loved it. It was my favorite class. I did well in the exams, but I didn't get that vision. That the teacher just wasn't that mentor that I needed. And I think that's probably why mentoring was so important to me when I did find it eventually.
Now, you've mentioned your mother, but your father, as I commented in the introduction to you, and his two brothers were famous in Ireland as
Yes.
professional sportsmen in the Irish sport of hurling. I don't know how many of us here, how many we're now up to 33 people, how many know what hurling is, but it's a big deal in Ireland. In fact, such a big deal that one of your uncles has had a statue erected in Wexford in his memory. I mean, to what extent, given that presumably when you were out with your father, people would come up to him, what extent did living in his shadow of his fame affect your life, if at all? Does it all, as an adult now, affected you because of that aspect of your childhood?
No, I mean, if it did, only in a positive way. I suppose we just knew that my dad was someone that everyone knew. And if he got into trouble, which he was a bit of a scamp and he would get into trouble, that if someone didn't realize who he was, and it could be a parking ticket, it just could be something where he just needed someone to see the different side of it. And then they'd realize that it was my father. And invariably they would say, "Oh, Billy, we're sorry. We didn't realize it was you. Off you go. You can do whatever it was you were planning on doing." So we found that as a family really very entertaining. And I suppose the thing is, youth is wasted on the young. So as a youngster, I didn't really appreciate in many ways just the heights that these chaps got to in the 50s. I mean, he'd already retired by the time his children came along. But no, it didn't affect me adversely, if anything, because he was such a character. I feel that rubbed off on us as well.
Can we possibly see the photo of him, Ian? What a photo.
Yes, if the photo does come up on the screen, this is a press photo of my father back in the 1950s. Bear in mind that these men played in Croke Park, which is the main stadium in Dublin. They played to crowds of 70,000 people. And it was a huge, huge event to attend. And of course, you rooted for your county. That was the main thing that, it was the raison d'etre for anyone really, was supporting the hurling team. So that's him, that's a press photo. And he and his two brothers, the three of them, the Rackard brothers, brought the county to several gold medals in front of crowds of 70,000 people. It really is a magnificent achievement, and Wexford has never performed so well ever again. And I mean, after his funeral, there was a wonderful tribute paid to him and his brothers. And the coach at the time of the Wexford team said, "In a land without royalty, the Rackards were kings." And that's he was referring to my father and his brothers. And my father was the last of the men. So it's very poignant.
Yeah. You're freezing a bit, but let's move on, because I want to ask you, because at the age of 17, in spite of all this wonderful upbringing you've had, you decided to leave home and go and live in Copenhagen. What inspired you to wrench yourself away from such a close family life in Ireland? Why did you do that?
Well, I think it was a continuing sense of adventure. I loved my family, I loved where I lived, but I thought I could easily become quite inert in a place where there wasn't much going on. And I had a window of opportunity where I really did need to see the world. And literally, my back garden, you could see the ships coming in from Pembroke, from Le Havre in France, from Cherbourg. So I would wistfully sit with my legs dangling over the gentle cliff face and watch these ferries come and go. And I suppose it did sow a seed of the adventurer in me. And at the tender age of 17, I didn't know what I wanted to do after I left school. So I got a job as an au pair and I moved to Copenhagen, and I got on very well with the family who hired me. And I continued then. I returned and lived in Copenhagen later, about 18 months later, and then studied Russian and worked with them in their management training company. They weren't a usual family. They were a very unusual family.
Well, we want to talk about that family too a bit more, but the Russian, why go to Copenhagen, learn Danish, and then start saying, "Oh, I actually want to go and learn Russian"? That doesn't seem to me a very logical move. What was your thought process?
I don't think life is logical most of the time. Life is I think a sequence of reactions to things that happen. I mean, it was the second time that on my return to Denmark, that I decided to study Russian. It was in and around the time of Glasnost and Perestroika. Reagan and Gorbachev were very much on the news all the time. Star Wars, as a child, grew up with the threat of potential kind of nuclear war and all of that. And I was just intrigued. I was intrigued at the idea of learning Russian, having studied Danish, and I got on with it very well. And, the old adage, don't let education get in the way of your learning the languages that I had been taught at school. And sadly, it's still the case. It's very hard to get that passion of learning a language across in the schoolroom. You've really got to be in the country. And of course, I had grasped Danish, and studying in Denmark, there was a practical element. It was free. I had worked there. I had paid my taxes, and I was entitled to a free education. So I learnt Danish to university level and decided to go to the Slavic Institute of Copenhagen. And that's where I did Russian for a year.
And then you decided that your Russian, you were never going to pass this unless you actually lived in Russia for a short period. And as I understand it, your host, the person for whom you were acting as the au pair, had strong connections with Moscow and was able to fix it for you to be able to go over there and work for a few months. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it was an extraordinary kind of serendipitous thing, really, that my Danish father, as he was known, Klaus Muller, was the head of Time Manager International, who was a management training company. And they were the first into the Soviet Union. And so they had an office. They had 36 offices around the world at the time, and Moscow was one of those places. And I asked, could he get me a work placement? Because as much as I was enjoying my course, it began to show that as the course became more and more in depth, that my knowledge of Danish and Russian combined was a toll, and I just needed to go there. This opportunity to go there.
Isn't it fun? You freeze occasionally, but only very, very occasionally. But it's when we talked about this offline, as you might say, your movements between Russia and Denmark became very confusing. If we could just brush over that and just say, you did end up in 1991 in Russia with some Danish friends, is that right? And then the attempted coup on Gorbachev happened. They immediately departed, but you decided not to. Why?
That's correct, yes. Well, really, because I had this work placement lined up, and it was very devastating to our plans that the coup, essentially scuppered our idea of traveling around. But I had decided that, my plans were that I would stay. Now, once the coup happened, everyone wanted to leave. And I thought, well, I'm going to fail my exams. And it was because my dear Russian friend Irina said, look, Laura, you can stay if you want. You can sleep on the floor of my parents' apartment, because history is being made. And if you leave now, you are going to regret it. So I stood on the platform of the Moscow Central Station, and I waved my Danish friends goodbye with tears rolling down my cheeks, because I really did want to go home. I was worried that my mother would be concerned, and I wasn't particularly worried for my safety, but it just felt very, very serious what had happened. But something made me stay, and it was then when I stayed that Irina, this friend of mine, she was secretary to a writer called Yuri Koval, and we would spend time in his studio, which we had done before. I knew him well by then. I'd even met him in Denmark previously. But it was my work placement. I was told that I did have to go home, that it was too dangerous. So I didn't have my work placement to go to in the end. And it was then that Irina said, just stay with us, it's fine. And I did.
Of the events in the streets, did you? Did you see a little of what was going on during that tumultuous period?
Oh, yes. I mean, you could easily have been, in danger if you saw fit to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was walking past a real kerfuffle one evening. It was just getting dark, and a statue was being pulled from its plinth. And I remember leaning down, and there was a big commotion going on. And I just leaned over, and I picked up a little rock, and I scurried home back to my Russian family. And I got to this tiny little kitchen where the grandma was brewing some tea, and this little black and white TV was on. And I said, oh, I just walked past that. And she said, really? She said, that's the head of the KGB, Dzerzhinsky, being pulled from his plinth. So, and I didn't really even know who Dzerzhinsky was. Again, you know, if one could see these things with more mature eyes, you know, but I did. I saw the head of the KGB being pulled down from his plinth. That wasn't an everyday occurrence, for sure. It was very memorable.
Now, during your time in Moscow and in Russia, you began some artistic work. We've got a couple of examples of your work, one in Moscow, one elsewhere, I think, in Russia, if Ian could possibly bring it up. Because what did, in fact, get you started? You mentioned Yuri Koval, who I'd like to come to in a moment, but did you not do these sketches before? Before you met him or afterwards?
It would have been kind of in and around the time of Yuri Koval. So that one, there's some writing on the bottom left-hand corner that says the House of Writers, or the House of Books. And if anyone's read The Master and Margarita, the House of Writers is featured in that. But I mean, I was fascinated with the architecture, and I suppose I am, I always have been. But to the other one, which was basically a black marker, that was a sketch that I did while Miguel and I visited Yuri's dacha in the countryside, which was about a 4-hour kind of teeth-rattling journey along potholed roads in a small Lada car. And we stayed in this little log cabin. I remember getting very, very ill actually afterwards, because I just slept on a very cold mattress. But the Russian countryside is quite spectacular. And that is an example of just some of the free sketching that Yuri would say, you know, draw and paint what you see, but just give it that little bit more. So there is an element of more flamboyance to the smaller study that you see there on the screen. The one in pencil is much more considered, much more hesitant. And I suppose that wasn't under his tuition at all. I guess I just decided that I wanted to go out and sketch. Whereas the one with the trees and the fence, I think I was very much in the moment, because I did it there plein air. I was standing looking at those trees and looking at that Russian dacha.
Now, you mentioned again Yuri Koval, but before we go to him, and I do want to do that, I do want to talk about Miguel, because a bit earlier, not this moment, you had gone on a trip with some friends to on a journey towards, I think, including Siberia. What happened? How did your romance with?
I didn't quite catch your question.
Oh dear, yeah, because you've frozen, alas. Can you hear me now? Oh dear, this is fun. Well, the question I'm trying to ask is about, yes, Laura, you're back. I want to ask you really how you got to meet Miguel, and then how it was that your romance blossomed on the way to Siberia.
Well, I met him in Denmark, and we had a friend in common, and it quite quickly came out in conversation that he was of Russian origin, that his parents were Russian immigrants who had fled during the war to Argentina. And Miguel himself was raised in Buenos Aires, and the family moved to Vancouver in the 80s. So he spoke fluent English, albeit with, I think, a Latin American accent. But the fact that he spoke fluent Russian, you can imagine I was kind of starstruck, because I was studying Russian. And of course, the good old cliche, he offered to help me with my homework. So I fell for it. What can you do? But we did end up taking a journey from Copenhagen through Eastern Europe to Moscow. Before I went with my Danish friends, I went with these other friends for one kind of preliminary journey, if you like. And it was then that we stopped off at, we traveled through Berlin, Prague, Budapest, Kiev, then Moscow, and then on to Novosibirsk in Siberia. And you couldn't just move there or travel. We had paperwork to permit us to do that, and it was in Siberia that we kissed for the first time. So it was very romantic, and love blossomed. But then he went back to Canada about 3 weeks later, and I thought I would never see him again. That was it. When we went back to the West, back to Copenhagen, I said goodbye to him, and I thought that was it. I was never going to see him again. Little did I know that that wasn't the case.
And we'll come back to Miguel a little, I think, later. But now I want to talk about the really significant figures that you met in Russia. You mentioned Yuri Koval, who proved to be an important influence on your artistic life. In what ways did he actually push your art forward?
I think the main thing that Yuri, and in fact, not to confuse the issue, but I have a book. I don't know if you can see it. I have a book that was published after he died. And in there are some fantastic, I mean, they are black and white, but I think you'll start to see, I mean, this is one of his drawings, but Yuri had this lyrical way of drawing. He was a writer primarily. He was a writer of children's books, and he was a very well-known man. And there are a lot of documentaries, if you put him into Google, I mean, they will all be in Russian, but he, and it saddens me no end that my Russian is not strong enough to digest this book, because it is written in a very intellectual, clever Russian, which just, you know, doesn't cut the mustard for a foreigner like me, who didn't study it in depth. But he had a profound effect, because I think he was very charismatic. Miguel and I would meet with him in his studio. We'd drink vodka, he'd play the guitar, we'd sing all these wonderful songs that he knew. And of course, I then latterly spent time in his studio when my plans to work fell through. And it was in his studio. I remember saying to him one day, will you show me how to paint? I think this is what I want to do. And he said, okay, well, let's do it. And he would send me out onto the snowy streets. By October, it was already snowing. And I was there from August to December. So he'd send me out in the snowy streets to paint something. And then I would come back to the studio to a pot of boiled potatoes and a shot of vodka and just warm up. And then, you know, he would critique my work, and then I'd go off again and do something. And bear in mind, I didn't understand half of what he was telling me, because my Russian wasn't that good. But he was intrigued and I was intrigued. We were fascinated really with each other. We were both aliens in each other's worlds, if you like. But his studio, his creations, he was a sculptor, he taught, he knew Tarkovsky, you know, he was an extraordinary man, and I was very, very, very privileged to be in his company. I didn't realize probably until he died just how privileged
We do have
he
a
was.
pastel of his from 1991, if perhaps we could just show this. It takes a moment to come up.
Well, interestingly, Zoe, that's a pastel of mine, which is rather
it's yours.
interesting.
That
is one of my... Yes. So, I mean, you know, I think if you look at my cityscapes now, and interestingly, that view that I'd showed you from the book, the one, the purple and blue one, that is a view from his studio along the river Yauza in Moscow. And then that church is not far away either. And it was about line. He just taught me to have the confidence to commit to a line that may not be correct, but it was the way I saw it, and it was a lyrical rendition rather than an exact kind of journalistic approach to what was the truth.
And later, I mean, later you became apprenticed to two other Russian artists, Yuri Komonenko and Yevgeny Lanceray. Tell us about them a bit, because they're obviously important to you as well.
They were very important, and there are a few others that which time won't allow. There was a wonderful another Yuri Fateyev in Riga, and I spent time with him in Latvia a bit. But I would say Lanceray, who would have been a descendant from a Napoleonic general, a lot of French settled in Moscow. He was the grandson of a very famous painter, but he himself was a sculptor. But because we met, in fact, through Miguel's parents, they put us in contact with them. I asked if I could do some painting lessons with him. So he set up a still life, and I did my first painting of a balalaika, and he explained what you know, just certain technicalities that I hadn't had with Yuri. Yuri was more about, look at this poetry on the street, just see what you can make of it. Whereas Yevgeny was more technical side. And then Fateev, or the other Yuri Kononenko, different again. And in fact, he was hired by my Danish family to paint in Denmark. He was actually brought over, and his work was very different. It was about water-based gouache layers on paper and just getting a layering technique, which I think I'm actually employing a lot now. I feel like I've got all these voices behind me now when I look at my career to date, and I still remember things that they all said. And the one thing that Yuri Kononenko said is the moment you put a pen or a paintbrush to paper, you become an artist. And that's what we all need to believe. Any of us who are creating.
I think, Ian, well, it certainly was a painting that looked like it did. Let's just see if we can bring that one up.
Yes, it was. I mean, it was an amazing. Where he lived was an extraordinary studio. That's it. Yes, that was my first proper oil study that Yevgeny set up in his apartment, and it felt very grown up to do it, and I enjoyed it. But I was really relishing Yuri Koval's kind of no rules kind of thing. Just kind of get a feel for your interpretation, and I think that's what I carried through with me. And then when I went, as I'm sure you'll allude to later, when I met my next mentor, I felt that there was very much a correlation between what I was drawn to, what I felt. You know how you can listen to something, but it doesn't resonate. You can hear it time and time again, and then you hear it later on in your life, and it resonates with you. What always resonated with me was the artists whose company I was in, who were saying, you don't have to paint what you see. You don't have to paint the exact likeness. Just paint what you're feeling about what you're seeing, and it doesn't really necessarily have to bear a big resemblance. And that was a revelation to me, because in school it was all about, oh, it's got to look like, you know, a subject, it's got to look like something, and it doesn't have to. It can, you know, and it's going to be an ongoing challenge. It's not something that I've mastered by any stretch of the imagination, but just to be very, very fortunate to meet these artists. And I think it alludes to your original question in Ireland, that I, as much as I grew up in a creative household and a mother who was incredibly creative, I'd never met proper artists, and these people were proper living, breathing artists, and that's all they thought about. And that was very exciting.
Now, your period in Russia wasn't actually, if you look at the totality of your life, a long time, but it was obviously very formative. But you did leave, and then I don't want to, if you don't mind, to get the details of going to Copenhagen and going elsewhere, but Miguel arrived back in your life. You thought he'd gone. That was the end of Miguel, and you sort of thought, okay, that's over. That's an episode. But he arrived back, and you ended up in Canada for a while together, having got married. Is that right?
Yes, we ended up returning to the ex-Soviet Union the following year. And in fact, he proposed to me the December that I was there on my own. He phoned me up from Vancouver, and he proposed to me over the phone on the 6th of December, because he decided he had to know whether he had a chance or not. So then I said, well, I don't know. I sent him a telegram, and I said, it's not no, but it may be yes. So we ended up meeting again, and then we did end up going to Canada. And sorry, Zoe, I've lost the
thread. I want to get you through Canada, and that you went to started an Arts Foundation course in Dublin, and then tragically your mother died, I think in 1994. Can you just give us a sort of very short version of all of that? The sequence of events.
Yes, well, yes, I did my foundation, but yes, the reason I came back from Russia, and Miguel stayed for longer, the reason I came back was that my mother was dying, and I came back and helped nurse her, and my sisters and I nursed her, and she died, and the bottom fell out of my world. And Miguel came back. We stayed in Ireland for about probably 9 months, 12 months. And then I found it very painful. I did do that foundation year, as you say, but we had an opportunity to go to Canada. It's a convoluted story, but he needed to go, and it was a welcome excuse for me to flee. I felt like I was fleeing Ireland because I just felt so desperately melancholic with my mother gone. And so we went to Canada, and we stayed for a year, which was wonderful. I got to spend time with his parents, and I was creative all the while. But it didn't work out. We felt that we wanted to be in Europe, that Europe was just more, Canada was beautiful, full of incredible geography, but not enough history for us. So we returned, and because my mother, was actually English, and we had family here in the UK, various relatives, but my sister had actually settled in Bristol. So we ended up coming to Bristol in the late 90s, and that's 1997, and that's when we both stepped foot here, and we've been here ever since.
Well, how was it adjusting to all of that? You know, you've had this initially very beautiful country life in Ireland, then this exotic life between Russia and Canada and Denmark, and suddenly you're coming and living in England, a country that presumably you didn't know terribly well. And here you were in Bristol. How difficult was it initially, culturally, to adjust to being here?
Well, I mean, we were longing for normality, and it's funny because I remember coming to Bristol as a child because my mother had, in fact, my grandfathers on both sides of my mother's family. One was from Druidstoke Avenue in Stoke Bishop, and the other was from Zetland Road. So I actually was quite familiar with Bristol. But what we longed for was normality. And I mean, I was a homemaker. I wanted my own home. I was desperate to set up home. Not so much, I don't know, not so much broody for children, but just that obviously did happen. But I was longing to call somewhere home. It was too long that we lived out of suitcases. We were trying different places because it was very unusual that we met in Denmark. We fell in love in Russia, you know, and all of these things. None of them were ever going to be none of those options were ever going to be a long-term thing. So it was only ever going to be Canada, Ireland, or the United Kingdom. And so, yeah, the UK, my sister being here, was a wonderful refuge really for us because we just didn't know where next. And we were here for we got work very, very quickly. We were here for about 9 months. And I remember saying to Miguel, "Are you happy?" Because I am. And he said, yeah. Is this normal? and we looked at each other, we said, yeah, this is normal. This is amazing. And then, you know, we got the house, we found a dilapidated 1930s house, and it was just my dream come true. I mean, you know, it was even more exciting than the idea of getting my paints out. I was desperate to be a homemaker and to have a home.
That's where you still are, in fact, in Headleys, is that right?
Correct. Yes, we've been here ever since. Yes. Although I've built a village hall in the back garden.
I was visited on the arts trail there. Well, you initially, to start, you were just temping, but you eventually became office manager of the regional development office. And you had 2 children. I don't know the exact timing of all that, but all these things were going on in your life. How were you able to pursue your art in those circumstances?
Well, yes, I mean, there is a correlation between those because I became the company loved what I was doing, and I was obviously, I mean, you know, I put my all into it. I wanted to be taken seriously, but it was when I had my son that I realized, especially, you know, him being in a nursery, I had to leave him there and then go to work. I realized that I was very unhappy. And in fact, I mean, I was painting all the while, all those years leading up to this. And I even had my paintings in the offices where we were, and people knew I was an artist in my spare time. But it was when I had my son that I realized in order to be a good mother, I had to be a happy mother. So I resigned. And I became a stay-at-home mum. Tess, our daughter, followed later, only 18 months later. And so really my significant amount of work in Bristol was done during that time where when they were asleep, I was painting, and I just got every moment I could to work. And when they got to school, kindergarten, all of those things, everything was just a little increment more to having more time to work. So yes, I was straddling being a mother and being an artist, but I always put motherhood first. That was a conscious decision because I knew just how much emotional headspace being a proper artist required. And I wasn't prepared to do that.
Take a look, or if we can, just take a look at the next picture with you up a ladder. Ian, if you could possibly show us that. There you are, busy with a very large painting up a ladder, which will pop up shortly. There you are.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes, that was my first proper commission, and I registered as self-employed that year, and my kids were still in primary school, because there's a delightful picture somewhere of them, just not even touching the bottom of the canvas. They were so small, but I got the contact through the North Bristol artists, and myself and actually Joe Whiteland, a wonderful batik artist, we both were commissioned to paint these very large paintings, 9 foot by 5 foot. She did a batik. My brief was to choose areas of interest within the geographical boundaries of the surgery at Lawrence Hill Health Centre. So I just researched. I took about 100 photographs, chose very few things that interested me, revisiting all my love of the cityscape. And the painting is, to this day, obviously not right now, but one can go to Lawrence Hill in a foyer, and it's quite a beast of a painting, and it was great fun to do. But it was a legacy. The surgery had been left some money, and they wanted to spend it creating artwork that would just bring joy to the patients in the doctor's surgery. So isn't that wonderful that happened?
It is. And there was also what you call your flower girl period, which is the next picture we've got, I think may relate to that. And you might talk about what do you mean by flower girl? I don't know whether you can bring that up.
I can. Well, yes, hopefully Ian will be able to bring that up. You see, I was very much painting cityscapes all the while, but my love of my garden was very much taking up a lot of my spare time. And I felt a need to break through just painting cityscapes. So I suppose they are autobiographical in one sense or another, that there was this kind of pensive feminine portrait. And I did several of them, but they were done with great feeling, because I was feeling slightly ill at ease with the idea of pursuing just cityscapes only. I felt like there needed to be more, that I was just responding to my own inner voice, really wanting to use my garden as a reference. So Flower Girl came about. It is a self-portrait, essentially, of me just taking a break from painting cityscapes that people knew were what I painted. And so over a couple of years, I dipped in and out of painting flower girls, and then I did some birds as well. So it was my way of staying in touch more with organic matter rather than the architecturally inspired work that I became known for. Because and to this day, I don't want to get stuck ever on just doing the same thing, the same subject matter. I think life constantly is moving, and it's very important to just listen to those moments when you feel that you want to focus on something else. And I think that's very allowable. I think a lot of artists think that they can't, that they're one-trick ponies. They have to just paint the same thing. But they are very personal to me. And they were, and people bought them. I mean, there were only a few that I did, but they were very meaningful. I kept that one that there was a gentleman who wanted to buy that one, and I wouldn't let it go. I own the original. I do have it as a limited edition print, and I did do prints of them. But I was just allowing myself to be guided by what I felt I needed to produce at that time. I was just responding to it.
And a few years later, you were working on some visuals at St. George's, which related to music, which somehow harks back to an earlier period. I don't know whether you can bring that up. There's I think it's a triptych or something. There's 3 visuals anyhow that, that you sent to us. If Ian can just find those.
Yes, that was a very exciting commission. I mean, that's just 3 of, I think, 6 I did in total. David Adams, this producer, was doing a musical performance at St. George's about the life of Shostakovich. And he contacted me because he felt that in St. George's, you know where the Reredos is in St. George's, that he felt that it would benefit the audience to have a visual of the different pieces of music that Shostakovich created. And so I was given a brief of each piece of music, and I essentially illustrated in the style of a Russian fairy tale painter called Alexander Bilyebin. And the hammer and sickle, as you might notice, is a theme throughout each of them. And it was a great privilege because Lorna Anderson, the soprano, was there. There were other performers who just, it was poetry, it was music, and it was a visual. And it hadn't been done before, to my knowledge, that they accompanied musical performances. And I ended up doing another one for them a year later. And it was very, it really stretched me. And but it worked. They loved it. And of course, it was, addressing kind of Soviet constructivist kind of subject matter, which I absolutely adored. So it was a win-win.
It just it almost comes round a circle. I just want to mention very briefly a terribly sad moment in your life, which I think came the year before, I think in 2009, when you had a double blow of losing both your father and one of your sisters, which must have completely stopped your life in its tracks.
Yes, it did. It was an annus horribilis. Our dog died later on that year, and my work. It was very interesting. My father died. We don't have the image to put up, but in the vein of the Flower Girl series, I painted a tree that I call the goodbye tree, and there were birds on this tree. And there were 4 birds on the tree saying goodbye to our father. And I painted it the night he died. And then 6 months later, sadly, my sister died of cancer. And so then I felt a need to express that grief by painting another goodbye tree, this time with 3 birds. But in fact, the hospital where she was in palliative care found out that I had done these paintings, and I ended up doing a painting for them. In fact, I lent a painting to them for several years. And then I was contacted by the radiology department because a member of staff had died unexpectedly. And they were just so touched by my story and my need to express it in my paintings that I ended up, it wasn't my intention, but I ended up with a commission from the Waterford Hospital in Ireland. So, well, I mean,
okay.
For me is that I was leaning on my painting to bring me through it.
It's a really tough thing. I can move on because of time, because obviously these are tremendously and devastating points in your life. But if it can move from the very sad to something which certainly brought a lot of happiness to people of Bristol, and that is you got involved with this public art, initially with the gorillas and then Gromit and Shaun the Sheep. Could we possibly show an image, I think with both of the gorillas and with Gromit? Because somehow you suddenly became a major figure, in a sense, in all of these 3 major trails.
Yes, I mean, it was, I don't know if you can hear me, Zoe.
Yes, I can. How did that happen? But you've frozen, which is rather sad. You'll be back in a moment. I know you will. But, I can remember.
I think we're okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you again now, yes. Yes, I was asking, how did you
Lovely.
get involved with the gorillas and then grommets? You
Well,
haven't
I
heard
got
me.
wind of, I submitted some designs. I'd heard that there was a call out, and the Wow Gorilla, I think it was 2010, was the first one. And in fact, a friend said to me, one of the co-founders of the North Bristol Art Trail, Sarah Cooper, said to me, she printed it off and she literally kind of thrust it at me and said, look, you could do that with your eyes closed. Why don't you apply for that? So I looked at it, of course, thought, no, I can't. Anyway, I did. I submitted designs and I got accepted. So doing the gorilla in the Radisson Blu hotel foyer was quite an experience. And I loved painting on that scale and scaling him up to actually do a cityscape on the curvaceous thighs of a gorilla is quite an experience, and it definitely whetted my appetite for grommet. So of course I submitted designs for grommet, and two of my designs were chosen, and it just snowballed from there. I got on so well with the charity that they asked me to work with them, repairing all the grommets before the auction. Just working 12-hour shifts, repairing very high-profile grommets, from Paul Smith to, oh my goodness, just Gerald Scarfe.
Your work was auctioned off. I mean, so these grommets went for quite a lot of money. How much did they go for, the two grommets that you did?
The two grommets went for £47,000 in total, which was staggering, absolutely staggering. And that went towards an MRI scanner at Bristol Children's Hospital. So incredibly worthwhile stuff. It was a lot of work and so much fun for everyone. I mean, the city went bonkers, didn't it?
It did. I had my families coming from around the country to walk this trail. I was around there with my grandchildren. Now, Shaun the Sheep came along, and you were more involved with it then, organisationally, and doing stuff down, I think, at Broadmead, was it, or wherever it was, in the galleries.
Yes, it was at Cribbs Causeway, actually. We had behind the grommet shop, it was a bit like the Wizard of Oz. There was a curtain, and behind there, all this stuff was going on. There were about kind of 15 artists working away at their designs. But I mean, I had submitted a design like I did the previous years, but then they wrote to me and said, actually, A, yes, we like your design, but B, could we hire you as an artist coordinator, because we really need someone with experience to help other designers to realize their sculptures, because you had people who were CGI animators, you had all sorts of creatives from the industry coming in with fabulous designs, but a lot of them wouldn't have really used paints and brushes. So it was very different, coming up with a design to actually executing it on a large 5-foot fiberglass sculpture. So I was there on hand to help people with their materials and just troubleshoot. I mean, it was time sensitive. Everyone had to get their designs done with a time slot, and then they would leave, and then a new bunch would come in. There were 80 of them to do. So it was very, very tight fit, but it was very enjoyable, and met some wonderful people along the way, some fantastic artists.
Must have been very intense. But I want to move on a bit, not much, to the day you found yourself or got yourself onto the roof at the M Shed, which seems to be an important day for you.
Yes, I mean it is, Zoe. In fact, it was the year of the grommet. It was 2013, and I attended the launch of Grommet Unleashed, and it took place on the top of the M Shed. And I was standing there with all the other artists and Nick Park, and it was all wonderful, and it was a super sunny day. And I looked across and I saw the view of Millennium Square, and I just took my breath away. I had never seen the view from there, with the planetarium, the cathedral. But the way I painted my cityscapes up until I knew I couldn't do justice to the scene.
Right. Again, a short moment while until we wait until Laura returns. I hope she comes back quickly.
Paints, and I painted plein air just intuitively, because I didn't know quite what I was doing, other than I'd given it an awful lot of thought that I needed to loosen my style in order to do justice to this view, because there was just so much going on compositionally. If I was to do it in the more structured, graphic way that I had done cityscapes in the past, in fact, I hadn't ever chosen that scene before, because the way I had painted previously, it just wouldn't have worked. It would have been too tight and complicated. So yeah, it was a turning point, because I looked at that painting and I thought, that feels like me, that feels the way I want to go. And then I think we started off with that Florence in the Snow. That was an oil, actually, I think. Yeah, I think it was an oil.
But we've also got that image, I think, that is from the roof of the M shed, don't we? If we could just have a look at that.
Yes. Yes. The painting, hopefully Ian will work his magic and we'll see the painting. And it felt very exciting for me. So that's an example of an old one. That's an example of an old cityscape of the Arnolfini that is very, it's stylized. It was the way I painted. I mean, I look with great nostalgia back at that image, but I don't know if Ian is able to scroll through and find the one that has got the, I'm just going to see, I don't know that, so that, yes, that's the, I think he needs to just scroll down a bit in between. It's got the hustle and bustle. There we go. Well done. He got it. That's it. Yeah. So you've got the planetarium, you've got the cathedral. I mean, there's very little that's overstated, because that was my challenge, because if you were to focus on any point with detail, it just would have turned out so saccharine. And I knew that I had to change the way I approached the painting. But I do have to say at this point, I had been attending lessons with Rachel Heming-Bray. You obviously know her with great fondness, as do many of us here tonight. And I had gained so much confidence with my time spent with Rachel, that even though we always studied the figure, I know that I had her voice in my head, was doing that study as well. So I really do want.
Right. Okay. What's happened? Have we lost you altogether, I fear? Which is not exactly the ideal situation, is it? Laura, do come back to us all. We're very close to the end of the initial interview and discussion here, but there was something else I do want to put to it. I imagine Laura will rejoin us as soon as she can. So I'm left spinning wheels a bit, but I would just mention that when I do get her back, I'm going to talk to her about the last major influence in her life, which is the romantic impressionist painter by the name of Hugo Grenville. Now, many of you who heard Laura speak to our club, in Bristol itself at Fredland Park, will remember her talking about that. And she went with him to Spain, and he's influenced a lot of the change towards the kind of work that she is doing now. I wonder, while we're waiting for Laura, if you could just bring up the image of the work that she did, plein air, in Spain, and she was there with Hugo Grenville. But Laura, come back to me, please, Laura. There we are. But she's not here to talk about it. I suggest we just leave that image there for the moment.
Can you?
Oh, you're back.
See me?
You're
Hello.
back. You're back.
Hi. Hello.
I've just been explaining about Hugo Grenville very briefly, and I put up here this painting of yours, which I think was in Spain. And I think you are with Hugo. Can you talk about Hugo briefly, why he has been and is right now such an important influence for you?
Well, I think he kind of, I felt drawn. I mean, I remember I have Kath Reed, the wonderful local artist who I know that many of you will know. I have Kath Reed to thank for introducing me to Hugo Grenville. She was taking a course and I visited her on a lunch break, and I remember going to his studio to see her and just being overwhelmed by his color palette. There was a magic to the studio that just was very, very arresting. And it was a bit like that moment when I met Yuri Kaval in Moscow. I just felt, his presence, being in this place, will be good for me. And we went out for a cup of coffee a couple of days later, and we became instant friends. Miguel and the kids know him really well. I ended up doing a course of Hugo's. But I was and this painting was done in Spain. We went on a trip to Andalusia, and this is an early morning painting as the light was coming round, and it's an oil study. And it was a real breakthrough. It was another breakthrough. It was about 2 years after I'd done the Emshed painting. But this time this was in oil, and it was about a response to light, because Hugo very much is a man who just wants to enjoy the sense of freedom that light and color can bring. And if you notice very carefully, he very rarely uses all three primary colors at once.
Well, to wrap up the discussion between you and me, and we're not wrapping up the evening, by the way, because we'll carry on letting others participate and talk to you. The work with Hugo has taken you to a more abstract style, or certainly less, it's quite distinct from your work earlier. Where do you see your work going, and particularly now that your children are in their late teens and you're anticipating you're going to have a lot more time in which to work professionally? Where do you see it all going?
Well, I feel I am on the right trajectory. I built my space, and that has been a huge pivotal moment for me. My quest is to distill my paintings to a point where I want to focus on color and form, but with as much simplicity as possible. I suppose the older that I get, the simpler I want my images to be. That doesn't mean to say that they haven't got a level of complexity to them, but I very much enjoy working with, I paint in oil, but I do paint in acrylic a lot at the minute. I am drawn to abstract, I always have been. So for now, I'm just going to keep doing and not think too much about where it's leading, because if you think too much about where you're going, then you become too self-conscious. And it is the anti-hero to creativity, is to be self-conscious about what you're doing. So I am just going to paint, not question it, just be guided by how I feel. And but to be, succinct, I am looking to reduce down further the elements that inform a good painting by way of certain things that allow the viewer, take them by the hand, allow them into the painting, and they can make up their own decision. It's not for everyone, but the main thing that Hugo Grenville taught me to decide was, are you a poet or are you a record keeper? And I have decided that I would.
Oh dear. We've certainly got a few gremlins here. It's a shame.
Are you hearing everything?
You're back again. You dropped out again briefly. Well, Laura, can I suggest that we end this part of the evening here, and that I open it all out to everybody else? I'm going to put it all on gallery. I know in particular, because Ian talked to me about it before, he had a question for you, or if it's a question or an observation really, about the development of your work. Ian, can I hand over to you? Are you there? You unmute yourself. You will need to unmute yourself. There you are, you've done it. Can't hear you though. It's just, the joy of Zoom. It's
Zoe, you're doing such a great job.
There you are. I'm finally with you.
Well done.
There's so many buttons that one has to press. Laura, thank you. That was really brilliant and very interesting and enlightening. Just having a look at how your work has progressed over the years, I find there's a common thread. And if, for example, let me pop back to a couple of pictures to highlight what I mean. Let me see if I can do this. Whoops, no, that's going the wrong way. Where is it? If you have a look at, where is it? Sorry, bear with me.
Okay.
Why, when we did the dry run, it was all at hand. Now it's not.
Yeah, well, that's the nature of life. It's just.
Bugger.
Technology is wonderful when it works.
Oh, yes, this was the image.
It's
Okay.
a bit clunky,
If,
isn't it?
have I shared this image yet?
No, we haven't.
Right.
We're not on screen.
I've found the image.
There we go.
Okay. This early image of yours has certain characteristics which I see have followed through in your more recent work. You've got this very much swirling sky, which isn't unlike Van Gogh in many ways. You've got swirling water. You've got key elements which make up your composition, these little bollards on the front, and the linear work which defines certain shapes, be it a boat or a building. If you have a look at another of your more recent works, where is it? Sorry, I am getting there. Yeah, this is a far more recent
Well done.
work, and one sees exactly the same elements coming through. You've got the same bollards. Okay, this is the same view, but the treatment and the interpretation is quite different. It's simpler and yet it's more complex. You've got the same brush strokes in the sky, the swirling sort of nature of the lines, toned down, but it's still the same sort of technique. And you've got the same, but far more articulate way of expressing shape and form. And it's absolutely marvelous how it's, you know, your techniques developed. And also the variety of strokes. You've got some underlying painting on the bollards, then you've overpainted with the water, and then later you've scratched through the actual swirls on the water. Yeah, it's really fantastic. And I look forward to the next step, which I think we have had a little eye on the future, and that is of some more recent works which you did. Sorry, we're going to fly through all of these because it's not part of the presentation. This work here, this is your most recent work. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is of a canal trip which you did in the, when was it? The end of last year, late autumn. And now there are your canal boats on the canal. There's the shrubbery and the trees. You can just make out the branches. I think it's a wonderful, evocative scene. And as you say, you're distilling it down to the bare necessities in terms of form and color and tone as well. You've got wonderful tonal ranges coming in here. Would you like to comment?
Well, I mean, other than thank you so much, Ian, for a wonderful trip down memory lane with that early.
Oh dear.
Laura, I thought my Wi-Fi was bad, but down on your side of Bristol, it's
Bad tonight. It could be the rain. The heavy rain.
It could
right?
be the rain. I seem to have full Wi-Fi here. I seem to have a full bar here.
okay.
Yeah. And
Don't worry.
your comment.
Never mind.
Response to what?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
okay? Well, look, Ian, I mean, it's an absolute delight to hear you describe those paintings the way you have, because, and you have read them correctly. You see, people have told me, even I had to really make sure that it didn't matter to me that I was moving on, even though people were used to me painting a certain way. But what is clear, a bit like anyone's signature or handwriting, is that it is there. It's a common thread that runs through everything. So thank you for that feedback. It's very heartening to hear you say that. I love bollards. They will always be in my cityscapes. If they, I will find any excuse to put bollards in. There's an Irish painter called Marky Robinson that used to paint people a bit like that, and I was very taken by his work when I saw it before. But this canal painting, which in fact I have you to thank for the journey that we took on that wonderful canal boat. It is about distilling things down to the bare minimum. And I'm going to read you something that Yvonne Hitchens said. And I mean, I'm a real fan of Yvonne Hitchens. I couldn't dream to be in the same conversation as comparable to him. But in fact, I just need to look up at my ceiling because I have it written on my ceiling. But he says, what I see and feel, I try to reduce to patches of line and pigment, which have an effect on our aesthetic consciousness, independent, although interpreting the facts of nature in terms of a relationship of all the parts. So I don't know if you heard that, but it's a very profound statement and one that I saw fit to write on the ceiling of my studio.
Right, let's see if we can take any comments from other people. Now, there are more people attending, there's over 30 people here that will appear, I think, on my screen at any one time. There is a fancy thing in here where you could put your hand up by going onto yourself on participants and doing it. But I can see Ian Barnes waving, so I'm going to take the easy route and ask him to speak.
Well, that was absolutely amazing. I really enjoyed that as overall. But just that where you finished up then talking about Yvonne Hitchens, I was actually thinking that, and I was going to ask you the question, Laura, had you been inspired by the work of Yvonne Hitchens? Because I could actually see Yvonne Hitchens' influence in that last picture. I thought it was, and the fact that you mentioned it was quite staggering, actually. So I was very, yeah.
Well, thank you,
very
Ian.
like his work, yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, the thing is, he painted the same scenes again and again and again. He was so familiar with it. His work ethic was incredible, and you see, this is what artists have to learn from artists is work ethic, among other things. But it was so prolific, and to see progress, you have to just be that prolific. But I adore his work, absolutely adore it. And I went to
that last picture. It's very similar. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. There was another point as well. You talked about the grommets that you influenced. Were you aware that there are now about 10 or more grommets actually in the garden of one of the houses quite close to Thornbury, where I now live?
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're on display for everyone to see.
That's amazing. I think the chat continues to do things. I noticed other artists painting more. It's amazing. They bring such.
Very good. Yeah, thank you, Laura.
They bring something. We're going to find out soon what it brings. But whilst we wait for Laura to come, you're back, Laura. You were just saying it brings. I think you're referring to the grommets. It brings. Well,
they just bring great joy, don't they? I mean, you can't help but feel happy when you see one. I think they were incredible. It's a real tribute to the Ardman team, isn't it? Really, and Nick Park.
Well, I cycle past them on a regular basis, and they always bring me joy. Just cycling past the garden,
exactly,
outside, and it's fantastic. So
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, you may like to try and paint one day. That could be a good little challenge.
Is there someone else who'd like to speak to Laura? I'm looking for anybody to wave at me. It's quite difficult because you're all these different images on the screen at the same time. Is that Anne Huddleston waving at me, or you just happen to be moving? No. Anybody else? Oh yes, hello, Priscilla.
Yes, I wanted to ask whether you paint in the studio, whether you take lots of drawing sketches, rough ones, back to the studio to work out, or do you really nearly always try to work on plein air?
Weather isn't practical to constantly work plein air. What I tend to do, and in fact, I did have a sketchbook to hand. That's a little, so I do plein air studies and then can go back to the studio. So what I will capture certain, elements within a view, obviously work with photographs. Any artist who says they don't, I think are probably fibbing, because it's about capturing the light at the time as well. That was the little quick study of the Yellow House in Stoke Park. I don't know if you can see that. So I go out with my sketchbook a lot, but I do, to answer your question, I do work on them back in the studio. And I always make a little thumbnail ahead of time, because when you reduce things down, when you reduce it to fewer elements, I find the technique of doing a little tonal sketch first, then small color study, and work on more, because I've got all the information, I've made all the decisions that I need to make in those two little studies, and it's there that you can sustain the mark making and the spontaneity that often gets lost when working in the studio.
Yes.
Yes, I'm now seeing Susie Palmer waving her hand. If you will unmute yourself. There you are. We can't see your face, by the way, Susie. We just see your forehead and your nose. There we are. Do go ahead. No, we haven't got the sound. You've muted yourself again. Unfortunately, only you can unmute yourself.
Can I just say thank you very much for that. Often I think the sketches, the preliminary, the spontaneous ones, actually are more satisfying than, if you have worked in the studio and tried to recreate, you've lost something.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. That is going to be the challenge constantly, is to try and sustain that spontaneity. And it really...
Right, now Laura's frozen, and I think, Susie, you've tried to get some technical help to unmute yourself.
I have tried to get some technical help.
Switching off your brain.
Can you hear me now?
Right, you disappeared again.
Hello.
Laura, but now Susie is trying to ask you something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes? Oh, Laura, hello. Thank you so much for your such really lively and inspiring talk. It's so lovely to hear someone talk with such enthusiasm about their work, and so passionate. But I'm very interested in your colour palette. I think that for me, as well as the lines and the sort of mark making, something that seems to carry through in your work is a very interesting colour palette. Can you explain a little bit how you approach the kind of colours that you use? For instance, in one of your very recent ones of the harbour, there are these lovely sort of turquoises, muted turquoises, greys, blues, and then these wonderful flashes of sort of orange, the kind of contrasting colour. And that seems to happen quite a lot, that you have quite a restricted colour palette, and it works so brilliantly well.
Well, thank you. Firstly, that's wonderful feedback. It is a fascinating journey to explore mark making, and I do layer. And I feel I'd like to follow up at some point. Maybe I could send Zoe or Ian one day a sequence of in-progress photos to help answer your question, because obviously seeing them visually would be better. But briefly, I will throw everything and anything from very dark splashes of paint onto the paper, and just not be worried about what I put on. But those of things like turquoise are on the original layer of the paper, and then I will wash over with maybe a raw umber, and then start to pre-mixed sets of thicker. As Ian pointed out, you've got the transparent and the opaque colours in relationship one to the other, and then I work around certain shapes so that I have the ground colour underneath. So the orange tends to go in at the end, but sometimes I will layer over that, so you have a more of a whisper of orange. But it's really in the doing that one can learn to do this. It's that there is no kind of strict way of doing it. I just find myself allowing the playful side of painting to take over and kind of guide me. I hope that makes sense.
Before you start, for instance, in the picture that we have on the screen now, I mean, have you decided before you start to paint this painting that you will not use certain colours? I mean, have you already restricted yourself to a certain palette when you begin?
Definitely.
Yes.
And definitely. And I think, in fact, you will notice that all my work, I never use all three primary colours. There's usually secondaries. And that's something that I learnt from Hugo Grenville, particularly. And the use of earth tones is it anchors a painting a lot. So as long as you have areas of dark, areas of light, and because I'm keen to distill my images, I do think about the color palette, and I make sure that I have a very limited family of colors on the palette, and I create all the colors I need from those few. So it would be a blue, it would be a yellow, probably lemon yellow, raw umber, turquoise, and then a good quality titanium white. And then I will make sure that I mix anything that I need. I mix from those colors. So I'm not introducing further instruments, if you like, to the kind of orchestra. It is still the same group of colors. And that's what I think is helping bring a certain harmony.
It's a wonderful integrity to the image, to the picture.
Thank you. I'm so pleased that you that you like them. It's wonderful feedback, because they're relatively new. I mean, I've painted these paintings since I had my studio. So it was why I wanted a bigger studio, because I can work on several of them at once. I can work on, 10 paintings, not in detail at once, but certainly underpaintings. So I mix up my colors in advance, so I'm not having to remix my colors and then worry about getting a tonal kind of drop. All the while, everything darkens as it dries. But it's trial and error. I have no formula, and I hope not to have a formula, because I think they will become stilted. And every time I come into the studio, it's by the seat of my pants, and I don't know what I'm going to be doing until it's done. So I wish it was easy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question.
If somebody else would like to ask a question, I'll need to have the screen share removed so I can see you. Yes, does somebody else want to say something to Laura? Just looking as best I can on the screen. Is anybody waving at me? Can't see that. Don't have to speak, that's for sure. Because if there isn't, we can quite cheerfully wrap up at this point, because it's only just a few minutes before 9 o'clock now. And I'd like to say that I knew that Laura would be enchanting, and she has been. And I can't believe any of you wouldn't have felt that as you listened to her. I'd like to thank Ian also, who's kind of acted as studio manager. It's quite a difficult production working with Zoom, as opposed to working in a studio. As you will have noticed maybe on the BBC and what have you, where they're having to use Zoom all the time now, it's very clunky. But I'm really grateful to him, and to be able to show the images on time as we have means a lot to me. But Laura, I'm profoundly grateful. And doing the research on you has been fun. I mean, just such an extraordinarily interesting life that you've lived, and you've got an awful lot more of it to go yet. I wonder what will happen. Thank you for being our guinea pig, as you might say, in this first time attempt at the format. What people thought of it, I hope they'll let me know, because we're
Well,
planning another such evening at the end of February. I don't know whether you like the way we've done it. I'm sure you love Laura. So I would thank Laura from the bottom of my heart. Someone was saying something there, though. Was that Sue? I don't know. But I can close the meeting here if you're happy with that.
well, Zoe, before you close, can I just say a huge thank you to you for all the effort and all the hard work that you've put into this. You just froze on me earlier on, so I didn't quite hear what you had to say. But I'm hugely grateful to you for your enthusiasm, and Ian, you know, to be you know, a very important sidekick to the evening, and just for asking me. It's a very isolated lifestyle that we all have as artists, and it's very nice to feel appreciated. So thank you all very much. I really do appreciate your interest, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
I think people did appreciate it, and I think they were enchanted by you, Laura.
Yeah, very good.